Okay, thanks very much for coming along. I'm delighted to be here. In 1999 I had a studentship here, but I was never able to come and take it up. So it's the first time I've actually been to the British School at Athens. I'm really delighted to be in here, to be able to talk to you now in here. It's just fantastic. Now tonight, what I'm going to do is talk to you about a very small group of Englishmen who were here in Greece during the Second World War, and they came here to. Well, that's pretty. And they came here to that's much better actually. They came here to save lives rather than wreak destruction and cause death, which is what the organisation they belonged to was chiefly involved in. So they were here. These were young British medical officers, and their role was to work with the British who were here trying to encourage resistance, and also work with the Greek Andartes guerrillas against the occupying Italians and Germans. All of them belonged to SOE, this organisation, Special Operations Executive, which was a secret British organisation, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that as I go on. I'll tell you who these young medical officers were, how they were recruited, what they expected to be doing, and then what they actually ended up doing. There's an important distinction to make, as I'll hopefully show you as we go on, and that the reality of what Greece was like was rather different to the one that they expected. What I'm not going to do is talk about policy or politics or the different guerrilla groups and their backgrounds and British policy towards them. That, of course, is such an enormous topic that would take up too much of this evening. But I will occasionally talk about the degree to which political tension did impact a little on what the British, and particularly the British medical officers, were trying to do. And as I go along, I'm going to be drawing from declassified records, because SOE's files have been released in London since 1997. These are the files related to Greece and other countries, but also they include the individual files of individual officers, and these are still being released. So some of the material that I'm talking about this evening has only come to light in the last few months. I'm also drawing on private papers and photographs as well, and these come from the families of some of the medical officers that I'll talk about. So that's what I'll be doing, but I'm going to begin by telling you really what SOE was and how it came to be involved in Greece in the first place. So as I say, all the medical officers belonged to SOE, and SOE was this secret organisation set up in 1940 when Britain was really on the back foot. It was a very desperate time for the British, and they were looking at ways of trying to hit back against the Axis, against the Germans, against the Italians, when Germany pretty much, and the Axis were pretty much in control of most of Europe, and Britain had been forced back into the British Isles and just one or two other spots in Europe. And it was identified relatively early on, in 1940, that one way of perhaps hitting back was by encouraging and working with local populations inside occupied territory to try to resist the Germans and try and hit back that way. Now, France is the popular image of SOE today. So if you're in Britain and you mention SOE to anyone in the UK, they may not have heard of it, but those who have tend to associate it with operations in France. That's a very emotive, romantic image of what SOE was up to. It was working with the French resistance. It's images of women agents parachuting into France in the dead of the night, people wearing civilian clothes and sabotaging railways and things, and generally acted like spies, trying to blend in with local population. Now, actually, SOE had a completely global role. By the end of the war, it was active in every theatre. It was fighting the Japanese in the Pacific. Until then, it had been involved in every European country that had been occupied by sending in trained agents. So these are young, trained agents who it specially equipped and trained for the task. And these agents this was one of the main ways in which SOE operated, were sent into enemy territory to work with the resistance groups and also carry out sabotage and assassinations and that sort of operation. But France was one side of warfare, but this other activity with sending in agents into the Balkans or into Poland or Italy or the Far East was a different sort of warfare, really. So this picture actually shows a group of SOE, a group of Burmese mainly. You can probably make out the British officer in there. It's on the back row with his teeth biting into his pipe. But this is more typical of what SOE was about. So he's in uniform there. He probably can't speak the language. He'd have an interpreter, and he doesn't blend in whatsoever. But this is largely because this was guerrilla warfare where the soldiers, the British in particular, did not have to really blend in with the local population. They'd have mountain hideouts or jungle hideouts, and they'd come out and do operations, and then go back again. And this is, in its way, this is exactly the same as with the situation in Greece. More than 200 British personnel were sent into Greece during the war, and the vast majority of them never really got out of uniform. Some of them grew beards just to really blend in and have a sort of empathetic connection with the Greeks. But they had no real need to dress in civilian clothes, speak the language, and infiltrate in amongst the Germans and live in Athens and try and convincingly put up an image of looking Greek. Now, some of these individuals, these 200 SOE officers and men who were in Greece, became quite well known. So many of you, I think, will probably have heard of these two men. Eddie Myers on the left and Monty Woodhouse on the right, the two senior officers really that SOE sent into Greece. And on the left there is the Gorgopotamos viaduct, of course, which was destroyed by Myers and Woodhouse and the Andates that they were working with in November 1942. Very famous SOE operation that was timed to assist the war in North Africa. The idea being that if they could sabotage this viaduct and sever one of the Germans' main supply routes to North Africa, then that would be of assistance to the British fighting in North Africa. But of course, these aren't the only two who were sent in. And as many of you may know, there are many archaeologists and classical scholars, of course, who were also part of SOE, who came here during the war. The names like Nick Hammond, Tom Dunbabin, who was in Crete. You've also got people like Eric Gray as well, and Tony Andrews as well. Many of these became academics after the war, but during the war, as young men, served in Greece as young SOE officers working with the resistance. And in fact, I noticed just arriving in the hostel yesterday, there are three names there from the Second World War. I think Stanley Casson, David Wallace, and John Pendlebury. And all of those three were linked with SOE at one point or another. Pendlebury was serving with SOE in Crete and was killed in 1941. Stanley Casson had worked with SOE early in the war and I think was killed in an air crash later on. And David Wallace was sent into Greece on a Foreign Office mission that was working with SOE individuals when he was there. And then, of course, you have Patrick Lefermer, very famous in Crete. I'm sure most of you know the story, but Lefermer was involved in a very famous operation to abduct the German general who was in command of Crete in 1944. And he did that dressed in German uniform, and that's him on the far right. The photographs on the left are from his SOE file, so I don't think these have actually been shown before. These come from his SOE file, SOE records. And that's him on the right, and that's Billy Moss on the left, who wrote the book Ill Met by Moonlight. And Lefermer's book on the kidnap was actually published just a few months ago, so his own version of the story was found among his papers after his death a couple of years ago, and has just now been published. Now, by 1943, all of this was increasing, so SOEs became far more involved in Greece, and it was then the need was identified for medical officers to be sent into Greece to help them. Now, it might seem surprising that medical officers were needed in Greece when, of course, there were Greek doctors and Greek medical staff and specialists here anyway. But SOE felt that quality and reliability was important, but mainly because, although there were Greek doctors here, this was guerrilla warfare, and Greek surgeons and skilled expertise and Greek medical staff with skilled expertise were hard to find. This was the sort of terrain that they were working in and being chased by the Germans up and down mountains. This was taken by a British officer in 1943 and then 44, the winter of 43-44. So it was far away from the Germans, but they needed to be mobile. And SOE needed, needed young, fit medical officers who could cope with this sort of environment. Just to give you an idea of quite the basic conditions of medical welfare for the guerrillas and for SOE missions until they started sending in medical officers. I'll read you a quote from a chap called Captain John Childs, and he was a British officer who'd been wounded in northern Epirus early in 1944 when he was accidentally shot by an Elas sentry who mistook him for a German. And Childs was taken to a hospital in early 1944, and this is what he wrote. When an Andate in Zagoria became a casualty, he probably received no medical treatment apart from the application of a dressing by his companions. Most wounded then had to walk, although a mule might be found for those incapable of doing so. The 8-hour journey I had to make was a comparatively short one. In most cases, therefore, wounds were treated considerably longer after they'd been received than they were on more civilised battlegrounds. He also adds that that just took him to his initial hospital treating space, and then to get to a proper hospital for emergencies took another 4 days. So SOE was aware of this and felt it really needed a medical officer for its own personnel on the ground close to where they were operating. But the problem was how to find these young medical officers. SOE was a very small organisation in 1943. It was small all the way through the war. Now, the work I'm doing at Oxford is looking at the SOE physicians and the work that they were doing and the way that SOEs interacted with the medical world. What's becoming clear is that its medical staff were very thin and very few. So for the first 2 years, it just had one medical officer in London, and that was it. Then it later started to use psychiatrists and psychologists for selection and recruitment, just to give it a bit more of an edge, to try and search for the right sort of people who could do this sort of work. This is not just medical officers, but searching for the right sort of agents and the right sort of people who could work behind enemy lines. But the only surgeons it had were involved in this sort of work, I'm just going to mention this briefly because I've just done some work on this. This is plastic surgery that was done to agents' faces, so for the purposes of disguise, which I didn't think existed until earlier this year when I turned up a file at Kew in the National Archives which talked a little bit about it. This is actually comes from a little booklet that they had available. It was almost you could go in and select the nose that you wanted that would be suitable for you if you went behind enemy lines. Actually, there's a better photograph that actually shows the sort of work that SOE surgeons did do. So here, the photographs on the top are before, and then the photographs below are after. As you can see, he's had work done to his nose and to his ears, which is actually quite simple to do. It's cosmetic surgery, but quite extraordinary, I think, to do it for the purposes of wartime work. And this is the best photograph I've come across so far. So this is a chap who was sent into France, and that's him. That's him later. You may have noticed he's growing a slight moustache there, but actually, if you look closely though, his ears have been pinned back, and his jaw has actually been widened. And they did the jaw by it's quite gruesome, by breaking his jaw and then inserting a piece of bone that they took from his thigh, and just to broaden his face that way. So wartime ingenuity there for you. So these are the surgeons, that's not the surgeon, but the surgeons were involved in this sort of work. But these were distinguished London-based surgeons. These weren't the right sort of people to send into enemy territory. So as I say, SOE needed young, fit men. And recruitment could be quite haphazard, and it could be quite amateurish. And this is a chap called Jack Dumoulin. Now, Dumoulin was one of the medical officers they recruited in London in 1943. I met him when I was doing my PhD and interviewed him. He ended up in Albania, not in Greece. But he's very interesting because he just told me about how bizarre the whole process was. So he was working as a medic. He'd just been recently qualified, and was working at with an army unit in the UK under an alcoholic commanding officer. So he was bored and desperate and wanted to get away. And then just read a notice in some orders that came around one day asking for people for hazardous operations, and that was it. So he went for an interview in London, and then had a bizarre interview where the man interviewing didn't actually know what he was interviewing him for. And Jack, nevertheless, was so desperate to get away that he volunteered for it. And then he and another chap, Bill Felton, who I'll refer to later on, who did serve in Greece, were trained in the UK, and they were sent out to the Middle East, to Cairo. And it was there that the two of them were given given some maths tests and psychological tests, written tests, and were told that whoever out of the two of them did best, they could choose which country they went to. And Jack chose Albania and came first, and Bill Felton chose Greece. But Jack was saying the two of them copied each other's answers anyway during the test, so it was all very random. Now, as you can see, Jack's in uniform. All the doctors they used were very young, all in the army, all very recently qualified. One was in the Navy, two were in the Navy, all relatively inexperienced. And as I say, very young. Jack was 24. The average age, there were 4 doctors went into Greece, the average age was 24. Now, crucially, SOE had to lower its horizons. It knew the limits of these men. It also knew the limits to which you could actually send them help. Stores had to be sent in by submarine and aircraft, and there were never enough of these to go around. So these were the priorities that they identified in 1943. I'll read them out, but I'll pop them up there for you as well. So the most useful duties, therefore, and that's because the document already discusses the limits, that our medical officers can perform will be: 1, to treat British sick and wounded; 2, to advise British liaison officers, those are the other SOE officers, people like Hammond and Woodhouse, that sort of thing, Eddie Myers, on medical matters; to act as liaison officers with local medical units, so that's local doctors, local expertise, local medical staff; to advise Cairo, and that's SOE's headquarters. Operations into Greece were planned and sent in from Cairo, of medical requirements, and distribute the medical stores we send; to send medical intelligence, and I'll refer to that a little bit later; and in the case of surgical specialists, to carry out specialist treatment of local sick and wounded combatant personnel. That's an important distinction to make, because there's nothing in here, as you can see, that talks about helping civilians or the local population as a whole. And in fact, the very first doctor that SOE sent in, his orders were even more limited. So he was sent in with a specific orders to just help British personnel if they're ever involved in any other repeat of the Gorgobotomos operation. So he was after set-piece large attacks. So he really was instructed to have nothing to do with the local population, or in fact, the local guerrillas. And this is him. So this is the very first medical officer sent into Greece. His name is Darrell Wilkinson, and he was 23 when he went in. He'd been at Epsom College, public school in the UK, and he trained at the University of London and St Thomas's Hospital, and then joined the Royal Navy. And then, this is all very quick. For all of these officers, almost all of them, they found themselves in Greece within more or less a year of even joining the army. So even a year before, they were just working in hospitals as very junior doctors. And then a year later, they found themselves in the mountains. Now, in early 43, Wilkinson was sent out to the Middle East, to Alexandria. It was there that he was recruited and joined SOE. That's him on the right, of course, in Greece. You can just make out. In fact, they're both, of course, in Greece. And he left an account that he wrote for his family in about 10 years ago. And he talks a little bit about his own haphazard way of being recruited. He wrote, "One day, someone in civvies, that's civilian clothes, came at the end of my short sick bay in Alexandria and insisted that we went into the middle of the parade ground." So the middle of the parade ground, a very large expanse of nothingness where they could basically talk to each other and nobody can overhear. He talked vaguely about a different sort of job, etc., without any details, and that if I was interested, I was to send a postcard to an address in Cairo saying that I would like to come to your party. I did join the party, and there in Cairo met Major Alexander Kennedy, and during a gentle interview, his chief concern seemed to be to know that I was not a homosexual. Now, Wilkinson, after that, was accepted, went in, received parachute training, received specialist training in weapons and how to survive. He also received a code name. The code names themselves are quite entertaining. SOE early on used code names for its men going in, which they used for radio messages between Greece and Cairo. And he used puns on people's names. So there was an officer called Power, for example, dropped into Greece, and his code name was Horse, so that's horsepower. Wilkinson was given the code name Razor. But the best one is probably Nick Hammond's, which some of you may know, which was Eggs. Anyway, so Wilkinson dropped into Northern Epirus in July 43, and he was to work with Zervas and Edes, as opposed to Elas and the Endates of that group. And within weeks he set up a base, he set up a hospital. He was there with an orderly as well, and he was soon at work. Now, he was with a junior assistant there called Lee Oldfield, Sergeant Lee Oldfield. And Lee Oldfield wrote a report later of their early activities, and he wrote very soon that they were pretty much in the thick of it. Lee Oldfield wrote, "After a particularly fierce battle between the Germans and Major Agarasi's band of Andates, we became inundated with casualties. But with the aid of women from the surrounding villages working as nurses, we were able to care for them all. Many quite serious operations were performed by Surgeon Lieutenant Wilkinson under anything but ideal conditions. And to save the life of one Andate, we extracted blood from each other by syringe and injected it into him." The conditions in Greece are important to underline. So this was epic journeys to get from one place to the other, long hours, either walking or on mules. And these are Wilkinson's mules. As you can just make out, I think, the Red Cross on the left-hand one. So that's his medical kit. Couldn't carry very much kit. So supplies had to be just emergency only. They did have some heavier equipment, but that had to be left behind on long journeys. So these were some of the limiting factors. There were also other dangers, of course, and the Germans being one. In late November 43, Wilkinson and his small group, Lee Oldfield as well, were forced on the run, chased by the Germans. And Lee Oldfield wrote another report of what he and Wilkinson experienced. So it reads, "On the 5th of November, we were completely exhausted through lack of food and being chased. We had no idea where the Germans were. Our only knowledge was the smoke of burning villages, and our only hope was to keep one village in front all the time. On the morning of the 5th of November, after walking all night to keep on the safe side of German flares, we were eventually overtaken by a German force and escaped by scrambling across the swollen river. We hid from midday until darkness. The position was extremely tricky, and though we could see every movement of force, approximately 2,000 soldiers with mules and mountain guns, we ourselves were hidden by the branches of a tree. When darkness came our way, our only way of escape was by climbing precipitous cliffs. We found this impossible to do. The Germans had camped in the village of Capro and had ringed the whole village with guard fires. All through the night, we had the illusion that these fires were slowly getting nearer. During the night of the 5th to 6th of November, the Germans burned the Greek monastery at Capro, which had been used as an Andate hospital. On information received later, I found that some of the more seriously wounded had been left behind and were burned with the hospital." Then Lee Oldfield and Wilkinson eventually find some Greek guerrillas to look after them. However, even then, there's another problem. This is at a time, of course, when Edes and Elas were open conflict was starting between the two, and the British were on the receiving end of a lot of this. So British personnel who were working with Zervas were often seen as targets by Elas, or at least were seen as problematic individuals who would be, by providing medical supplies and arms to Zervas and his Edes movement, they would be supporting Zervas against Elas. So the British were seen as suspects. And Lee Oldfield wrote, "On the 14th of November, while sleeping in a house, we were aroused by shots and shouts, and eventually the door was broken open and we were confronted by Andates," these are Elas Andates, "who menaced us with British Tommy guns. We were disarmed and our kit searched and were taken into protective custody and forced marched for 4 hours in driving rain." And in fact, they remained several weeks under guard, really, in custody, and they had a lot of their medical kit stolen. It should actually be noted that Zervas's medical personnel also took the opportunity sometimes to loot the British medical stores because they had such need of them. Now, another obstacle is the civilian populace. And of course, it's an appalling time for the Greek population. But of course, Wilkinson and the others, if you think about the instructions he received, said nothing about helping the population. And this does create some quite extreme dilemmas of consciousness, particularly for the medical staff. And this again is quoting from Wilkinson's memoirs, which he wrote long ago. "The only injunction I'd had in Cairo, i.e. before leaving for Greece, was that the medical supplies I'd been given were only for the treatment of our own people and not for the inhabitants or members of resistance groups. In practice, this was obviously difficult to reconcile with the Hippocratic Creed. On cross-country voyages, one also had to rely on the hospitality of villagers to put one up and offer us some simple food. In repayment, one would see the various sick they brought to us and might sometimes have to give out a little of this or that, though sparingly. Now also, with his assistant Lee Oldfield, Wilkinson was also involved in some surgical operations and did 2 amputations. This extraordinary photograph comes from his private papers and was taken mid-operation, as you can probably see. When 2 Greek civilians were brought in, both requiring below-knee amputations. And one of these is features here in this photograph. And later he wrote of this: Cairo would certainly have disapproved of this use of their equipment, but what was a doctor to do? Walk away? But one thing came out of this: the patient survived, but the surgeon, and he's talking about himself, as a surgeon did not. And this surgery was off the list of my future career. This was the next doctor that was sent into Greece. His name is Bill Felton. And he was 25. He'd been educated at Cambridge, studied at Cambridge and the Middlesex Hospital as well, and had been working in London during the Blitz as a junior doctor. Now Bill Felton, was the chap that joined SOE with Jack Dumoulin and ended up going to Greece while Jack went to Albania. And Felton was involved in civilian relief. It's very important, I think, to underline all this. SOE was involved primarily, or in the public image of it, is involved exclusively in killing and in destruction. But here you have SOE as an organisation involved in trying to do what it can with what tiny resources it has to deliver relief to the civilian population in the very isolated areas of Greece where it was operating. And you find doctors like Felton and the others doing as well what they can with the very limited experience and skills and equipment that they have. So the British were very aware of the famine conditions that were up in the mountains, and they do their best. What's interesting from the reports that they leave, because you have the viewpoint of British personnel in areas that are not penetrated by the Red Cross and are not penetrated by the Swiss and the Swedes, who were of course in Athens, particularly in 1944, trying to get relief into Greece. And the British also confirm the obstruction the Germans put in place to stop the Red Cross getting into certain areas, and also some of the black marketeering that goes on, and the failure of the Germans who occasionally banned Red Cross supplies because they thought the supplies would end up in the hands of the guerrillas. But you also find in these reports by men like Felton stories of the Germans engaging in black marketeering and selling medical supplies on to other people who don't need them. Now, the means by which they delivered relief was mainly in the form of gold, which they used to either hand over directly or to buy food and then deliver the food themselves. It was quite tricky because, of course, there were many people who perhaps were more mercenary, and a lot of pressure going on there. A lot of Hellas in particular were quite keen to be in control of the funds themselves, and often it did not go quite to where it should have, where the British wanted it to go. Felton's own role, he had 2 particularly important roles. One was in prioritising medical aid, where it should go, deciding who should actually receive it. And this is a quotation of one of the reports that he wrote. I'll read it out, but you have it, of course, there. So malnutrition was universal. He'd been sent to the mountains specifically to report back on this. On the condition in villages. So malnutrition was universal, but there were no cases of acute starvation. Everybody, in fact, had something to eat. The section of the population worst hit were the babies and young children, the reasons being: 1, an absolute lack of knowledge of infant welfare; 2, malnutrition of pregnant mothers giving babies a bad start; and 3, malnutrition of nursing mothers, that's young mothers. With these facts in mind, this plan was produced with a view of getting the money to the right people. 1, pregnant women are to be allowed half a sovereign, that's half a gold sovereign, a month on doctor's certificates. So that's a doctor's certificate proving that they require it. 2, says 1 there, but yes, 2, nursing mothers, that should be, up to 3 months after delivery, the same amount. In addition to this, quarter of a sovereign can be allowed for up to 200 sick children per month. This enables them to buy about half a pound of milk a day or 1 or 2 eggs, and allows a margin for medicine. The greatest need in this direction is, of course, iron. This is Felton again, busy at work. And you can just make him out, the name is directly underneath him. He also had a role in devising a scheme for delivering medical aid, which was establishing clinics in groups of villages So SU had a problem of trying to find trusted individuals to give stores to and to set up suppliers. So it went about, and it eventually managed to find groups of Greek doctors, individual doctors who were very responsible, very hard-working, and SOE felt happy giving them collections of stores. So that doctor would be in charge of various villages, and then these other villages would send a deputation to that doctor, and the British would supply that doctor. And the stores ranged from atabrine and quinine for malaria to things like scissors and bandages and material like that. The stores themselves were sent in by parachute and plane, or sometimes they were bought, sometimes on the black market in Athens. So the British would send in gold into Athens to try and buy medical supplies and also food, and then try and get them out again. It was quite difficult work. Now, it was Felton that used the word miracle man. I interviewed him a year ago, and it was then he was talking. I was asking him about work in Greek villages and how he was perceived, and he just said that when he walked into a village with penicillin or something like that, then he was always held to be a miracle man. This is Philip Worrell. Now, I'm going to talk about him. He's on both sides of him. There was interpreters, both from Athens, in British uniform, all of them. But the women on either side of him were his I'm not sure, they may have been sisters actually, but they were the interpreters he was using. Now, Worrell wasn't a medical officer, he was one of the liaison officers, a British officer. But he's interesting because he was given the responsibility for looking after Italian soldiers in the mountains. This is an area of relief which isn't particularly well known. Of course, it's dwarfed by the extent to which the Greek population were requiring relief. But it's interesting all the same. Several thousand Italians, of course, were left stranded in Greece in the mountains after the Italian surrender. They didn't know what to do, and they were just a burden on the local population. Elas was given responsibility for trying to help them as well, but then became so embroiled in other matters that it couldn't keep it up, and the whole thing devolved upon the British. Now, what Worrell managed to do was, and he was given a fund of sovereigns to accomplish this, was to concentrate the Italians in one town, which was Nereda in Thessaly. Now, in early 90s, he wrote a series of reports about this, which I'll read you a few extracts from these, because again, they bring to life quite vividly the terrible conditions it's an epic really of awful conditions that the Italians faced throughout the winter of 1943 and 44. So in early November 43, this is Worrell reporting about the Italians and the situation in the town that he'd set up with thousands of Italians in it. Life, although difficult, was not impossible. The weather was still mild, the houses were good, there was plenty of wood, the rations consisted of wheat, bread, macaroni, black and white beans, potatoes and chestnuts. Oil and salt were scarce, and the 3,900 we were feeding, medical stores were low. And a few days later, another 2,000 Italians arrived. These are from 3 other Italian divisions. And Worrell continues, with 3,900 men, we were nearing breaking point. By 16th of November, 1,700 naked, starving, frost-bitten, unorganised Italians had swollen our numbers to the gigantic figure of 5,600. The weather was breaking and winter arriving. Up till this time, food was the main problem, but now a fight against cold and exposure was beginning. Now, at the end of November 43, to make matters even worse, the Germans attacked the town. The effect, and this is Worrell again continuing with his report, the effect of the German 4-day blitzkrieg was appalling. The once lovely resort was a charred mess, the mission house had been dynamited down the hill, the chapel was burned and completely destroyed, but the worst perhaps was the fate of the immovable ill Italians whom we'd been forced to leave behind. They were lying in the burned houses with a neat bullet wound through the back of their heads. Some had been burnt so badly that they were unrecognisable. In the woods for days afterwards, we found the same bullet-marked bodies overtaken in their attempts to escape. Now the Germans pull back, Worrell returns to the town, and the Italians start trickling back. And in all, about 3,500 actually come back into the town. And again, he continues, the weather was becoming severe, the death rate stood at 4 a day. Men were living 40, 50, 60 in a small, rebuilt room with no fireplaces, no cooking utensils, no clothes. Eventually he managed to get some sort of food supply moving again, but then, alas, without any warning, suddenly imposed a 25% tax on the stores of food that were moving up into the mountains from the plain in Thessaly, the Thessaly plain, which prevented anybody really moving any supplies anymore. And Worrell continues, it took 19 days to get this tax removed, 19 days of the worst and coldest weather imaginable. The death rate mounted 7, 10, 13, 17, 21 a day. Graves in the cemetery rose to the figure of 850 by the end of January. And gradually the weather improves, the situation improves, food comes back, and the Italians are dispersed to better areas. But British medical officers continue working with them with vaccinations and providing food and treatment where they can. Now, a little earlier I mentioned medical intelligence. This was another form of work in which the British were involved. Effectively, this meant British medical officers in Greece were called upon to send out signals, reports of the conditions they were finding. Now, this was partly to alert the outside world so that they could send in supplies that they might need. So things like for malaria or typhus, typhoid, these sorts of things to try to, so that they could get supplies that they could cope with local conditions. But it was also with a longer term aim in mind, and this was to alert the relief organisations that by 1944 were preparing to go into Greece once the Germans had left, and to inform these organisations of the conditions that they were going to find and the sorts of material they would need to take with them and bring with them. These reports are quite interesting because, again, they give glimpses of the work that the British were doing, the British medical officers were doing in the mountains. But again, they also give an insight into the unique conditions that you don't find in the Swiss and Swedish reports, because these are very remote areas where the British were actually trying to work. So I'll give you a few quotes here from this is a medical report from April 1944. This is from concerning Epirus. British medical officers in Epirus and Thessaly report that the population in the mountains is showing obvious signs of undernutrition, and in the case of the inhabitants of burned villages, fugitives, and other destitute groups, relief is urgently called for. In Epirus, the children in particular are showing the effects. A British medical officer in Epirus found enlarged spleens in 80% of children examined in the mountain villages, and no anti-mosquito precautions in operation. Practically no quinine is available in this region. The Germans have now permitted the Red Cross to send food to the villages of Epirus, but carry out the distribution themselves in order that it shall not reach the Endates. There is no doubt that in Karitsa, at least, junior German officials have given in to the temptation of black market buyers who send the food into Albania. Observers now assess the amount of Red Cross relief lost in this way as up to 50%, and very little reaches the mountain villages. In the Peloponnese, conditions are more stable, and the Red Cross are able to distribute a good deal of food. Nonetheless, supplies are only just adequate, and the type of food cannot be eaten indefinitely without lowering the standard of health. Little enough meat was eaten by the locals in normal times. There is virtually none now. This continues all the way till the end of 44, the medical officers doing what they can with local populations, distributing relief, distributing medical care to the local populations. In the final months as well, though, these medical officers continued to be doing the job that they were supposed to be doing, the one that they were sent in initially. This is Captain David Chapman. He was the third medical officer sent into Greece. He was 24. He studied medicine at Durham University and ended up practicing as a junior doctor in Newcastle, and then joined the army in 1943, and a year later found himself, like the others, in Greece. He particularly was in Macedonia, what was then Macedonia. And he left a report of the final 3 months of 1944. It was a 3-month period that he described as a hectic period, full of movement, with a bare minimum of equipment, with little opportunity for civilian relief. So he actually found himself working more with British soldiers and American soldiers who were here as special forces, operating operations one-on-one against the Germans. He spent those 3 months crisscrossing the mountains on foot, again, just trying to do what he could for pretty much every situation he found himself in. And this is a quote from a report that he wrote about a report that he wrote on an ambush that took place, where he was called upon to provide medical support. An ambush was planned for the 12th, 13th of September. I made my regimental aid post advanced dressing station in a friendly village 3/4 of an hour behind the road. This was an ambush by British soldiers against the road. The ambush was highly successful, but unfortunately so was that of an armed and hostile village 10 minutes later. The British Sergeant Major was killed with a corporal, and Captain Wigley, who was in charge of the British party, severely wounded, and another British soldier slightly wounded. With complete lack of instruments, I did the necessary treatments on our 2 wounded under local anaesthesia. Wigley had been badly wounded in his left thigh and lower abdomen. The other man had traumatic amputation to 2 fingers. Chapman's also interesting that in his report, he also begins to detect, again, he's very isolated, but he also begins to detect Greek medical staff trying to get out of Athens up into the mountains to do what they can as well, which I think underlines the isolation partly of the villages themselves, but also some of the difficulties that Greek medical staff in Athens had actually getting out through no fault of their own. And I'll explain that by reading a report that he wrote. So in late September, a party from Athens of 3, a Greek malarial expert and 2 efficient sisters, arrived for 6 hours in Lavera. They had done various tours in German-occupied parts, but I was the first British officer they had met. It had taken much time for them to convince the Swedish and Swiss authorities of the need in the mountains, and it had been argued to them that since doctors were already scarce in the mountains, the people wouldn't miss them much. They called the villagers from the next village to mine and proceeded to vaccinate all the children against smallpox, and then see and treat all sick possible in their short time up there. The doctor and I did the spleen rate together, that was to check for malaria incidences, and I received some useful instruction. They left that night, quite rightly happy in their good work done. I had learned that day that there was some goodness in the world. Now in late 44, of course, the Germans pulled out, and with them actually, shortly afterwards, SOE left as well. Their role was done. And they had nothing left to do. Chapman actually hung around for a little while, stayed a little while and stayed with the relief organisations that came in. He advised them a little. But of course his masters were SOE, not the Allied relief organisations who came into Greece in late 44, early 45. And so he was pulled back out, and that was it. Now I'll finish actually by telling you just a little bit about what happened to these 3 men, these 3 young medical officers after the war. I think what's interesting is I was chatting to somebody as I came in about the can-do attitude of some of these individuals who were involved in this sort of unusual, very energetic, active wartime work. And what's interesting is that you find the careers of these young medical men remain energised, if you like. They become very accomplished at what they do. So Chapman, for example, he returned to civilian medicine. They all returned to civilian medicine. None of them stay in the army. He trained as a surgeon, worked in the UK, and then spent 20 years in South Africa, having a distinguished career as a university lecturer, but also as a missionary surgeon in Zululand. So that's again working with other cultures, perhaps that he'd had minimal contact with before, but certainly had that appetite to work where he was needed. He returned to the UK, finished his career working as a surgeon, and as you see there, died in 1997. This is Darrell Wilkinson. Now Wilkinson, he left Greece quite early in February 44, but then saw out the war working on boats in the Aegean. So he was still working as a doctor, but was working in distributing relief and dropping off agents and stores on the islands. Now, post-war, he had a very distinguished career in dermatology. He co-edited a very famous tome called the Textbook of Dermatology, and wrote a lot about it. He was a fellow of the Royal Society of Medicine, president of the British Association of Dermatology, really played a key role in establishing dermatology, the study of skin disease, as a discipline in post-war Britain. And he's also very much a polymath. He wrote poetry and wrote, and he was writing his He was going through his memoirs and writing his memoirs when he died in 2009. But 4 years before that, he wrote a little passage which I'll read to you here, which again sheds some light on the fact that it took him so long really to put pen to paper. And this goes for so many people who are involved in irregular clandestine warfare, which was also drilled, when it was drilled into them that things were secret and shouldn't be spoken about. So he wrote, "I was building up my career in the competitive post-war medical world and cut wartime companions from my mind, especially as, at the time, SOE, etc., was still under wraps and its records classified. It's only after their release and on my retirement, many years ago, I'm nearly 86 now, that I got down to jotting down records of memories, anecdotes and odd encounters at which I still scribble away all over the chaos of my study. Many old companions are of course dead, though I've resumed contact with a few or their sons here and there." As you can see, Wilkinson died in August 2009 at the age of 90. And finally, there's Bill Felton. After Greece, he returned to the UK. He married and then was posted to the Far East to fight the Japanese. And he'd actually expected to parachute in behind the Japanese lines, much as he'd done in Greece. But in the end, he had a responsible headquarters job, effectively supporting the other doctors who were sent out behind enemy lines to support guerrilla warfare against the Japanese. Now, after the war, he returned to civilian medicine, but also did that for 10, 15 years, but then actually went into business for 20 years. Worked as the managing director of Hallmark Cards in London, so a complete career change. And then after that, oddly enough, went back into medicine, retrained as a specialist in venereal disease, and then saw how his career as a very distinguished specialist in venereal disease. Now later he would talk about Greece as being the best years of his life. I think this is, and they all say this is this outdoor life, very intense way of life. And he says walking, climbing, riding mules, and building lifelong friendships with Greeks as well as SOE colleagues. Now, Bill Felton, as I say, I saw him a year ago today, so I actually went to see him and interviewed him in his home. I'd never met him before, and he was living in Hove on the south coast of England. And it was then that he used the Miracle Man quote. And then just 3 months ago, he died in August 2014 at the grand old age of 96. And I'll finish there, and I'd just like to dedicate this lecture to him, because he's, I think, the last of the medical officers who was here during the war. Thank you.